I'm Mindy Peterson, and this is Enhanced Life with Music, where we explore the ways music makes our lives better. Ryan Dusick is the founding drummer of Maroon 5 and is now an associate marriage and family therapist, a mental health coach, and the author of the book Harder to Breathe, a memoir of making Maroon 5, losing it all, and finding recovery. Ryan went from being the drummer for the world's hottest rock band to being forced out of music by physical and mental health challenges. He spent a decade suffering from depression, crippling anxiety, and substance abuse before beginning a journey of recovery in 2016. Ryan wrote his book in hopes of helping others who might see themselves in his personal struggles. He now works as a mental health professional and advocate, spreading the message that recovery is possible, along with a new life path full of meaning, purpose, and fulfillment. Welcome to Enhanced Life with Music, Ryan.
Hi, Mindy. Thank you so much for having me on.
My pleasure. Great to have you here. Let's start out talking about your book. I loved your book. It was incredibly raw and honest and vulnerable. You kick it off with a prologue that tells the story of you being kicked out of Maroon 5. And it was just heart-wrenching to read that. But I'm glad you put it where you did, because the further I got in the book and really understood the history that you had with these bandmates and just everything that you went through with them, I kept thinking back to that prologue and thinking, the further I get in this book, the more painful it would be to read that account. And Adam Levine actually mentions in the foreword, I think, that telling you that you were out of the band was it's still the hardest thing that he's ever had to do in his life. And you lived it. The book tells a lot about how you and your bandmates went from being high school friends, forming this band in your parents' garage, to how the band became kind of the world's hottest band, rock band, with a multi-platinum album, multiple hit songs, 2 Grammy Awards, 20 million albums sold. And anyone who wants to read more about that will really enjoy that portion of the book. It's really fascinating. But I want, in our conversation, to talk about what happened next. Can you explain just a little bit of the challenges that you were facing around the time when it seemed like all of your band's dreams were coming true?
Yeah. Well, first off, thank you for the kind words. And, I think you said raw, honest, and vulnerable. Those were things that I tried really hard to do in the writing of the book, because I knew that if people were going to relate to the things that I struggled with, I had to be really, really very honest and authentic about what I went through. Otherwise, what was the point? I think that people connect when you get the sense that somebody is being authentic, and we need more of that in the stories that we hear. And so for me, it was our dreams were coming true. It was the moment in our life that we'd been working toward for a decade at that point, all the way from starting the band in my parents' garage and playing around town here in LA, all the way up a decade later to playing on the biggest stages in the world, headlining arenas and playing on The Tonight Show and Saturday Night Live and touring the world. So it was everything that we had dreamed of. And in some ways it was as exciting as you would imagine. We were doing a lot of things that were only fantasies up until that point. But privately, for me individually, I was starting to break down in ways that I didn't even fully understand at the time. I felt physical pain in my shoulder. I felt that drumming was getting harder and that I was getting physically exhausted and fatigued because we'd been on the road at that point for a couple of years. You don't realize when an album blows up and you have an artist that breaks through in the way that we did around 2003, 2004, how much work has gone into it up until that point. I mean, you hear the overnight success stories, and that's what people talked about with us, especially when we won our Grammy in 2004 or 2005 for Best New Artist. It was like, the best new artist that took over a decade to get
Yeah, you point that out in your book. It's like, Best New Artist. We've been at this for 10 years.
Right, exactly. So in 2002 and 2003, the first 2 years that we were promoting the album Songs About Jane, we played over 500 shows just in those 2 years alone. And that's not including all the promo and the travel and the photo shoots, video shoots, interviews, meet and greets, going in and playing acoustic shows in the radio station or in a record store. It was nonstop. I mean, there were no breaks. At most, we had one day off every couple of weeks, and that was a travel day. We had a long drive, a 14-hour drive or something like that, or a flight day or whatever. So that was what life looked like, and it was very exciting, everything that we were doing, but it was very fatiguing. And for somebody like me, who was already somebody who carried a lot of internal pressure, I was a perfectionist by nature. I was somebody who struggled with anxiety, and I hadn't even really reckoned with it because it wasn't something that it wasn't overt anxiety. It was internal. I don't think anyone would have noticed it externally at that point. And
it comes up several times in the book. Adam mentions this, I think, in the book you do, that you were always the adult in the room.
Right.
And there's, I could totally picture that person. I mean, I can relate to that personality, being the responsible one.
Yeah, I was very together and very responsible. I was the oldest guy in the group. And when we started the band, I was 16 and I was the only one with a car. My hand-me-down Jeep Wagoneer, which was falling apart on the highway, but we all piled in there, and we put all the gear in the back and went to our gigs and everything. And I was the one who was on top of everything. If you from the outside, if you looked at us, I was the one who had it all together. But in the course of being on the road for that long, and somebody who put a lot of pressure on myself, now that was meeting up with external pressure, and the intersection of those two things was kind of a breaking point for me, because it's one thing when you're playing once a month on stage in front of 200 of your friends and family and you get all excited. I never really had stage fright. I just thought of it as excitement. You have an adrenaline rush that goes all day until you get on stage, and it was a lot of fun. But now you're doing that every single day, and all of the adrenaline that goes with that, and me wanting to be perfect and do everything exactly right and be my most dynamic self. But I was an introvert by nature. I was somebody who needed my downtime and needed to recuperate. And I also was somebody who was a self-taught drummer. And so there were some skill sets that were lacking in terms of just the fundamentals, which made it more taxing for me, and also contributed to what I was starting to experience, which was a lot of self-doubt and imposter syndrome.
And I'm just going to jump in real quick, because that point that you just mentioned, as a piano teacher for years and years, that jumped out at me like, oh my goodness, I want students to hear this, that proper technique is really important, even when you're the drummer in Maroon 5. Like, proper technique would have really helped you out in terms of having more stamina and more strength and endurance for playing more and longer. So when I saw that, I'm like, ooh, good point for, music teachers to point out to their students. Technique is important.
Absolutely. And it would have made a huge difference. I didn't want to hear that when I was a kid and just wanted to do things my way. And there is a trade-off between the two. I think that as a creative person, I think that it did help me find my own style and sound. The fact that I didn't know the right way, the quote unquote right way of doing it. I was just making it up as I was going along and emulating the things that I thought were cool, without any sort of standards of what perfection was to anyone else other than me.
Sure.
So in that regard, I think that it helped develop my own individual style and way of contributing something creative to our sound. But the downside is that my playing was not efficient. My technique was definitely lacking, the sticking technique. So I was essentially an athletic guy that was pounding out every beat like I was, throwing hammers at the drums.
Sure, that technique and form would have been a really helpful tool to have in your tool set when you needed it.
Right. And so it was a combination of a lot of different factors. There was the physical element where I had these injuries. I had a pre-existing injury as a pitcher. I played baseball growing up in my shoulder.
Prodigy level pitcher.
Yeah. When I was like 12 years old, I was a champion in Little League, and we were playing in regional tournaments and everything. And, everyone was saying I'm going to be pitching for the Dodgers someday. And I believed that at the time, and maybe in another universe that would have happened.
You had sort of an overuse injury caused by poor coaching, it sounded like.
Yeah, in those days we weren't counting pitches, and I did have a few coaches that were not too kind, and I had some problems with overuse and my shoulder and elbow breaking down at that time. So I had that pre-existing injury. I didn't have great technique to be able to play with endurance and control without exerting myself a lot. And then I had this other psychological element, which was, the insecurities that I carried, the anxieties about being perfect. It sort of manifested in being obsessive compulsive about the drums. And you put that all together, and then you all of a sudden, you've been on the road for 2 years playing every single day under that kind of strain. And now you're on the biggest stage in the world in front of millions of people watching you every day, and feeling it's no longer just fun and expression the way that it had been when we started the band. It's now expectation.
Sure. Yeah.
Not just our expectations, but external expectations, the world's expectations, our record label, our management, our touring promotion team, like a lot of the systems involved with a career at that point are much larger than when you're playing out of your parents' garage. So now all this external pressure meeting up with the internal pressure in a way that it just became an overload to the point where I really hit a wall and essentially had a breakdown.
Yeah. Well, the human body doesn't recognize the difference necessarily between, quote, good stress and negative stress. Stress is stress. And you kind of say in the book, you feel a little bit odd about saying that it was a traumatic experience or was a type of trauma, but it is. I mean, it's nonstop high stress on mind, body, and spirit for extended periods of time, years. And you did ask for a break. You asked for help. You explained what you were going through, and the manager just sort of discounted it and was like, hey, at this point, you need to say yes to everything. And that was the constant message that you were getting. And like you said, there's stress that comes with success, and people don't think of living the rock star lifestyle as being stressful, but it is. There's like you said, the high expectations, the nonstop photo shoots, shows, publicity, traveling, fan interviews, signing your autograph. It's just constant. One other thing that I just want to point out is you mentioned in your book a bit of, I hadn't heard this term before, but manorexia. And at the time, the fashion was sort of this boyish waif type look. And you had photographers tell you look too healthy and like kind of slouch down and you need to be more skinny. And you say in the book, you just can only imagine what it's like for women and girls who are under even more pressure to be skinny and look perfect all the time. So yeah, you have all of the stress. You're asking for a break. It's just being discounted. Has any of that changed in the last, 10 or not even 10 years since then? In terms of how managers approach artists and recognizing a need for a more healthy balance in their lifestyle, because the lifestyle you describe is just inherently unbalanced and unhealthy.
I think that a lot has changed, or is at least starting to change. I'm not in the middle of that world anymore, but I have sort of gotten pulled back in, because I wrote this book about my experience in the music industry. So I've been doing a lot of, interviews and other things that are related to the music world, which I'm grateful for, because I wish that 20 years ago when, we were on the road really intensely for the first time, that some of these things existed, that there were voices and there was a public discourse around mental health and around physical wellness for performers. I mean, it's, as you said, mind, body, and spirit. You can't neglect any one of them, right? Otherwise, all of them suffer. And from afar, at least, looking at what's changing, I think you're seeing more stories and more advocacy, which is wonderful. In terms of the bottom line and how these industries function on a day-to-day basis, I don't know how much it's realistically changed yet, But I think that there is more of an awareness, and I think that there is a willingness and at least an acknowledgement that, look, if you're just thinking about the bottom line, if you're just putting these artists out on the road, people in this situation where historically we've seen one after another people break down and end up with situations where they have substance abuse problems or a mental health crisis, outcomes that can be not just tragic in terms of your career, but in terms of your life and well-being. I think there's at least an acknowledgement that nobody is profiting from that outcome, right?
Okay.
If you're building a business, you want to build a sustainable business, and that requires, all the moving parts to be healthy and working. And if your artist has to cancel a tour because, they're having a breakdown, that's going to hurt your bottom line a lot this quarter and this year. But if that's what's needed to maintain a career, then you have to think in terms of the long term.
Long term. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So you had these overuse injuries. You had some of these other factors, mental, emotional, psychological, kind of all feeding in to create a downward spiral, which you go into quite a bit in your book. It got to the point where you couldn't physically play the way you needed to, which led to you leaving the band. It started out as sort of the idea was that it would be temporary, and it turned into something that was permanent. And the downward spiral kind of accelerated at that point, possibly just with the loss of identity. I mean, that was the loss of your social life. It was who you were. You didn't necessarily have anything in mind to transition into in terms of another career. And it was kind of like, what am I going to do? Anything I do at this point is going to be just pale in comparison to what you had already done. So you had, about 10 years where you really struggled a lot with substance abuse and depression and anxiety. Tell us just a little bit about how you went from that time period to discovering and kind of kicking off the career path that you're on now.
Well, it was totally devastating to have to walk away from not just the career that I had built over a decade, but, my whole life and my whole identity. And I think most artists can relate to this. Your art becomes your entire world.
Right.
It's your self-definition. It's the thing that you live for. And also when you're on a team like that, in a band, it's your whole social world. It's your sense of connection and belonging. So in every sense, in a relational capacity, in a purpose and meaning capacity, and just everything that was a part of my self-definition was all wrapped up in being a member of that band. So I really struggled with the loss of that. It was really a grieving process, I think, that I had to go through. And I went through all the stages, the depression, the anger, the bargaining, and the substance abuse. Alcohol in particular was one of the ways in which I coped. When, of course, it made everything worse, and I had to deal with everything that came with that, and my anxiety got worse and worse. But it was about a decade of struggle before I kind of hit a spiritual bottom where I felt.
And I'm just going to interject real quick to a pretty significant component that I left out is you were going to doctor after doctor after doctor during this time, trying to figure out what was going on and fix it, and just weren't getting the answers that you needed. It's like one doctor, you'd be referred to one specialist who would be addressing a very narrow sliver of symptoms and prescribe maybe a hydrocortisone shot or give you this diagnosis that just there wasn't something that was all encompassing to fix everything. And that was incredibly discouraging and frustrating too.
It was absolutely confounding because I knew there was something bigger going on. I just I didn't have the vocabulary or the education to understand what it was. And what was worse is that none of the doctors or therapists or professionals of any kind were able to put their finger on what that was. I mean, they were able to look under a microscope, do an MRI and see that there was inflammation in my shoulder, that I had, chronic tendonitis or tendinosis. And they were able to do a nerve conduction study and see that I had slowing of the nerves in my right arm. And, anyone who was looking at me could see that I was depressed and that I was, there's a lot of stuff going on where you go to one doctor and they give you one diagnosis. But yeah, I didn't feel like there was a holistic approach to it. I think that oftentimes the wonderful thing about Western medicine is how specialized it can be. If you have a brain tumor, there's somebody who's done 1,000 operations on that very specific thing and can go in and take that tumor out. And that's why we do things the way that we do, so specialized. But there's a downside to everything, right? There's pros and cons. And the downside is sometimes you miss the forest for the trees, right?
Absolutely.
And how everything is integrated. And in particular, I've just seen a disconnect between the medical world and the mental health aspect, and seeing how connected the mind and body, and then that third element of the spirit, which is a whole other conversation.
Right.
The interplay of all those things and how important it is to see how those things are all related. That was a big part of what I went through. And you mentioned earlier trauma. That was the other aspect. I had a hard time looking at what happened as trauma because I had reserved that word for things like war zones and childhood abuse and sexual abuse, those kinds of things.
Yeah, things that are inherently negative.
Yeah, really like life and death, life changing in a physical way, those types of traumas that we relate to that word. But for me, it was kind of a slow moving trauma. It was a breakdown that was slow and steady. And over time, you apply enough pressure and stress to a human being, and eventually there's a breaking point, right? Mm-hmm. And when I look back and I recognize that happened on stage for me in front of the world over a long period of time, night after night, until I finally passed over that threshold, that my nervous system essentially reacted the same way that anyone who's been through a trauma, their nervous system would react. You become hypervigilant. You're having a reaction where you're seeing this stimulus as a threat, even if it's not. You can't blame somebody who's been in a war zone and there's been bombs going off around them, that they hear a car backfire and immediately they're back in that place where my life is in danger. Right. And that's the bodily reaction their nervous system is having. That's essentially what happened with me with the drums. My body was just like, this is going to kill you. You need to get out of there. And so that's why it wasn't allowing me to coordinate to play the drums anymore. And so not understanding that at the time and not being able to get a proper, description or diagnosis of what that was that I was experiencing made it that much more confounding for me, because I just felt like I was defective in some way. I felt like I was a failure. And those were the kind of ruminations that I had been having that led up to that point. And then when it was kind of confirmed by the fact that I couldn't play anymore and I had to walk away from that career, that's where the downward spiral really took place, because I didn't have any sense of self-definition or self-worth at that point. And my self-esteem was just kind of going down and down. And so, of course, self-medicating didn't help. And so that's how the downward spiral happens. But the wonderful thing, and I've learned this as a professional and as an individual who's gone through recovery, is that we talk about the downward spiral a lot, but there's also such a thing as an upward spiral, right? If you can go downward and the behaviors and the thoughts and the physical element can all feed on themselves and bring you down further and further, the opposite is true. When you start bringing in positive elements, whether it be just behavioral or in terms of the cognitive element or the emotional element or the spiritual element, when you start creating that upward spiral, it does at a certain point start to feed on itself the same way that the downward spiral can. And that was true for me once I finally was able to find closure on that painful chapter of my life and move into this other chapter that was ultimately really uplifting and fulfilling.
Well, that's a really encouraging thought and just a reframing of it. And speaking of reframing, you sort of were able to reframe your story of tragic ending of your music career into a happy ending. And it sort of came about, I think, you ended up at Betty Ford for rehab. And at some point you were working with a therapist who asked you kind of a haunting question. Is there anything you can see yourself doing that provides a sense of purpose in your life? Tell us about that and how that sort of fed into you being on the path you're on now.
Yeah, that was a life-changing moment. And it's interesting to think now, because at the time I looked at this psychiatrist with whom I spent two-hour sessions in the first week that I was at Betty Ford. And I actually looked at his notes when I checked out. They allowed me to see all of the notes that the professionals had written up. And it was so amazing, even just 2 months into my recovery, to read his notes about me in our first session, what a mess I was.
Oh, really?
Nothing I was saying made any sense. And I was just totally, in the insanity of addiction at that point. But he really took his time with me. And in my memory, he was some kind of wizard who was just pulling out all of these insights from me, just asking me these questions and working this magic with me within a matter of weeks, changing my whole perspective and mindset on life. But now, kind of looking back on it, I think that I realized I was just in that moment in my life where I was ready to hear certain things, and I was ready to actually take action to change certain things about the way I had been going about my life and thinking. And so it was a profound intersection of the right thing at the right time. And I'm sure he's a great clinician, but I think it was probably the combination of those things. And so essentially, I don't know, it was probably a few weeks, maybe a month into recovery, and I thought I was doing great. I was getting along with all the guys in the dorm, and I was becoming one of the leaders who was running the groups and really getting, just invested in the recovery process and enjoying it. And he asked me one day, just very matter of factly, what do you think your purpose is? And I was taken aback because I was like, isn't the fact that I'm just getting sober enough? It sounded to me like he was asking me for the meaning of life. It was like, now I need to figure out the meaning of life already. I'm just getting a grasp on not drinking. It's hard enough, I didn't have an answer for him. He said, what do you think gives your life purpose? And I said, well, I think at one point music was that. And maybe that's still my sense of purpose. Maybe I'll continue to work in some capacity in music. And there was just kind of a question mark at the end of those statements. And he said, okay, that's great. But you're going to be going home in a couple weeks. And what are you exactly going to be going home to? What are you going to be waking up each morning to and thinking to yourself, this is my purpose for today? And I really couldn't answer that question. I was like, well, I have cats that I love. I have a girlfriend. I have a family. I mean, those are meaningful things. But it took me a while to answer that question. But I think him asking that and having me think about it in those terms was really, really an important part of the process. And if there's a chapter in the book, Connection and Purpose. That whole chapter about my experience at Betty Ford, I call Connection and Purpose, because the first thing that happened in recovery was finding connection, first and foremost with the recovery community. But that was something that I'd been lacking so greatly in my addiction, because addiction is a very isolating experience. The deeper you get into it, the more disconnected you are from life and from the people in your life and from the things that create meaning and purpose. So it was the step of finding some form of connection, feeling connected to life again and to other human beings in the process, that allowed me to start to discover new meaning and new purpose, and recognize that the things that I had thought were my purpose were at that point in my life, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily always the same thing. That because those things were gone, that I could not have meaning and purpose in my life again. And I think what dawned on me one day was that I had been sitting around, feeling so sorry for myself for a long time after leaving the band, that I was just kind of either resigned myself to the fact or to the idea that I would never have that kind of connection and purpose in my life again, and was just going to have to get through the rest of what was left of my life without that. Or that, if there was connection and if there was purpose in my life, that it was something that the universe or God ordains on you, that you wake up one day and all of a sudden the heavens part and somebody tells you, here's your purpose, or that I think that a lot of people go through life thinking like, well, I don't have any incredible talent, or I'm not, I'm not a rock star. I'm not a movie star. I'm not a CEO. What is my purpose if I'm not any of those things? And the reality that I was able to thankfully finally discover was that meaning and purpose is relative, and it's not something that necessarily anyone else can give you. It's something that you can choose and create for yourself. simply by deciding what matters to you, what you value, and by investing yourself in that thing. Certainly it's wonderful if you have a natural talent or something, a proclivity towards something that gives you a sense of flow and connection. And that's a good starting point to, like for me, writing the book was the most connecting flow experience that I've had since I left the band, because I'm a creative person and I will always be a creative person. And so not being able to do that with the drums and the band, being able to write and craft a narrative from start to finish, that was a really, a really creative and meaningful, purposeful experience for me. So I know that that's something that will be connected to everything I do that brings fulfillment in my life, is that sense of creativity and flow. But it's different for everyone. And it doesn't have to be something that you necessarily have great talent at. It doesn't have to be something that you thought you had a connection to when you were 8 years old. I went back to school in my 40s to become a therapist. I never in my life thought I was going to be a therapist or that I was going to work in the mental health field. I mean, if you had told me that 10 years ago, I would have laughed. I would have thought, And then I find myself writing this book and on this new mission of advocacy and talking about these things as a speaker and as a public figure in this way. And that's brought all kinds of new purpose and therefore meaning and fulfillment in my life that, when I was struggling, I couldn't see because I wasn't able to have that mindset of taking on a new challenge and just investing myself in something and creating purpose.
This is Bob Bender, host of the Business Side of Music podcast. Check out our show where we talk about all things related to the music industry. We laugh, we share memories, we discuss what's worked and what didn't work. Our industry is always evolving and can never be locked inside a box. From the rookie fresh off the bus to the well-seasoned professional wondering which new direction to take their career, our show covers all the bases. Join us as we chase this elusive animal we like to call the music industry. Check us out at businesssideofmusic.com.
In addition to music, I am passionate about health and well-being. For me, a healthy lifestyle includes eating a diet that is mostly whole, unprocessed foods. This is pretty easy when I'm close to home, but living a full life often takes us away from a convenient refrigerator and a predictable schedule. Enter my favorite whole food energy bar. Jam Bar is a certified organic whole food bar, non-GMO and gluten-free. Created by a food science and nutrition expert, athlete, and musician, Jam Bar is packed with protein and fiber and minimally sweetened with only all-natural sweeteners. It doesn't need to be refrigerated and has a 1-year shelf life. These bars do not melt, freeze, or crumble, which means they can go from a day of ice skating in Minneapolis to a trip to the beach when I'm visiting my daughter in Florida. The only problem with those beach trips is keeping my kids from eating all my bars because they love them too. Fuel your full life and healthy lifestyle with Jam Bars. Available at Amazon, select retailers, and jambar.com. For more info, you can also visit episode 160. Links are in the show notes. I love that word connection, and you've been using it a lot in our conversation, and you use it a lot in the book. You have that chapter that is on connection, and you talk in the book about the relationship between connectivity, connection, and music, and how music is such a powerful connector, and the relationship you see between connection and spirituality, which is really fascinating too, how you go into that in the book. In my day job, I work a lot with college music departments, music department faculty, and mental health is a huge issue for the young people that they work with, and just the demographic of young people, college students, high school students. What recommendation do you have for these educators as they shape the next generation of creatives? So that could be as they're working with students who may be struggling now, as they prepare students for stressors that are part of being performers, part of being on tour, part of experiencing high success or high failure, just working in the music business. Do you have any recommendations for these educators as they're working with these kids?
Well, I was really fortunate to be able to go in the spring to NYU and speak to a couple classes there in the music department, music industry department, about this very thing, because a great professor there named Professor Jerry Del Cogliano invited me, and he noticed that there had been a real uptick since the pandemic in anxiety and other mental health issues in his students, and that these kids were really struggling. I'm actually going to USC this month to do the same thing with another professor there. So
are either of those recorded, or will they be recorded and available for others?
No, a friend of mine shot some stuff on her phone, but that's about it. Maybe at USC I should consider maybe bringing in
right
or something. That would be a cool idea.
Yeah.
Thank you for
if you record it, let me know, because I know a lot of faculty members who would be very interested in that.
Yeah, it's really fulfilling, to be able to go in. I didn't have an education in music, certainly not in the music industry, and certainly not in the mental health aspect of the music industry. I had to learn all that on the job.
School of hard knocks.
Right. And sometimes really have to learn it the hard way. And fortunately, we're able to, reach out to young people now in a way that it wasn't available to me when I was coming up. And I think that look, we're dealing with a mental health epidemic in general, in the general population, just the state of the world. And certainly since the pandemic has changed a lot of things for us. I'm seeing it in my clients. Creative people by nature, it's a chicken or the egg thing, but they do tend to have a higher incidence of mental health issues and suicide and things like that, and substance abuse as well. And I think that by trade, and people that go into creative fields do tend to be people that are seeking some kind of outlet, some kind of expression for something that they're dealing with internally, and it's another one of those wonderful sort of paradox where there's pros and cons, and sure. This beautiful flower of a person who can have all this talent and all this to offer humanity in terms of something that is their expression and their art, also comes with a real sensitivity that can be vulnerable to certain things. And then you put that person in the context of a life and a profession that can be challenging in ways that other professions aren't to that degree. And you end up with that perfect storm that I ended up with, where you see people breaking down. And so I think that for, the question of educators or people that are trying to help people that are either, struggling now or may have those issues in the future, is to be, first of all, aware and mindful of those realities. I think that if you wait until somebody's really struggling, it's already a little too late, right? I mean, when somebody's in the position where they're having a breakdown on the road or working in the industry, they're going to have to go through the things that I went through in trying to overcome that. And I was one of the fortunate ones, of course, to find the help that I did and to be able to find recovery and find a new life. It certainly is a lot easier if you can start earlier on and instill healthier habits that are going to help you cope with some of those things. Because look at it, certainly a touring professional, that's a very unusual lifestyle, right? Sure. Most people don't live their life like that. It's a circus lifestyle, and there's a lot that comes with that. That means that the demands of your life dictate that you have to be that much more mindful of your self-care. We all need to be mindful of self-care, right? I mean, every human on this planet in the modern world has to think very mindfully of how they're taking care of the basic elements of their physical well-being, their mental well-being, and their spiritual well-being, if they want to function at their best and prevent the kind of outcomes that can happen. I think that the tendency tends to be, it has been historically, that this is an odd lifestyle, and not just touring. I mean, people working in industries that are different than your average 9-to-5 job can have a similar outcome. I think that historically we look at it like, well, these are different kinds of people, and this is a different kind of life, and the normal rules don't apply. Mm. And so when you're under stress, you just blow off steam in the ways we do in this world. You go out and you party. You do the things that rock stars do, or that, an executive at a music record label does. It's a different kind of animal. And you think, well, that's normal for that context, and you get by however you get by. But the reality is you're giving yourself a double whammy in that instance, because the demands and the pressures you're under are greater. The ways in which your life is lacking structure, normal things that create structure and give you just self-care without having to really try. I mean, most people, they have to get up at a certain point every day and go to work for a 9-to-5 job. And they have a certain flow to their life where they see the same people every day. And there's a certain amount of relational regularity to that.
And those people also have to get up at a certain time the next morning. So they're probably going to bed at a certain time.
Yeah, their sleep is already kind of regulated for them, as long as you're not doing anything too crazy. And the hours of the day when you eat, and the hours of the week that you have free, you have a working week and a weekend, and you have work time and play time. There's just inherent structure in that lifestyle that somebody in a creative industry might not have. So now you have somebody who might be already vulnerable to those things. You put them in a life that has less structure and less built into it to create those natural elements of self-care. I think that it just requires that much more vigilance in terms of really advocating for yourself, because nobody else is going to do it for you, And if I had gone into that lifestyle, realizing, look, the demands on me are going to be much like a professional athlete. Like, I have to be getting up on a daily basis and performing at a level that most people aren't asked to perform, being on stage under those lights and under those pressures. If I'm feeling the stress of that, and then my answer to it at the end of the week is to get wasted and, have a big blowout and not sleep, and then try to start the next week.
And to restrict calories so that you're thinner and less healthy looking, as the photographers are asking you to do.
I mean, think about that. Restricted calories, underweight, overworked, using alcohol as a coping mechanism, not expressing what's going on internally, not opening up and having an outlet to talk about what's going on inside. All of those things feed on each other in that downward spiral. So it's changing each of those elements one by one. They're behavioral changes that are very simple behavioral changes. Prioritizing sleep. If you don't have as much time for sleep, then the time that you do have for sleep becomes that much more essential that you prioritize that and rest and get your recuperation where you can get it. Prioritizing healthy diet. Getting exercise when you can. That's the very lowest level of the hierarchy of needs, right? Our physical needs. Starting there is a good place. But going up from there, I mean, we're all human beings. At the end of the day, even if you're a very special human being who is capable of living that life and being a really dynamic performer and personality, you still have your threshold as to what's going to be too much.
Sure.
And what's going to send you over the limit into a place of breakdown. And so being mindful of that and recognizing that we do have other needs than just nourishment. We have relational needs, that sense of connection that comes with feeling seen and understood by another human being and feeling that we're connected to something larger than ourselves. Because that's the other thing that can be, whether you're a performer or a CEO, it's very easy to get wrapped up in that ego trip. And once you're in that place where you think the world revolves around me and my needs, you've lost that sense of connection. Connection and spirituality is all about feeling like you're connected to something larger than yourself. It doesn't matter what that is. You can be a religious person and believe in God, or you can just be a sort of person who feels their connection to the universe and nature. And it can be as simple as just communing with your pet or with another human being or with a community of some kind. These things are just as important as the nourishment we get from the food that we eat and the sleep that we need. And so, and feeding our mind, body, and spirit all need to be nourished. Now, how do you instill this in a young person who probably doesn't want to hear all that and doesn't want to think I have to be so mindful of my self-care? Who in their college years is on top of all of those things in the healthiest way? Most people are just trying to figure out how to get through their day.
Well, one thing I hear you saying is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And it's more important to teach students to be self-aware and recognize when they're kind of approaching, I don't want to say hitting a wall, but when they have needs and need to make adjustments and tweaks. That's more important to teach than to teach other educators on how to spot warning signals. Because if you're spotting it's great to spot warning signs and be aware of what to watch for. But like you mentioned, once those signs are present and obvious to other people, it may be too late. Much better to teach students how to be self-aware and see those signs in themselves. And the other piece of that too is it's sort of like that you're teaching someone to fish rather than feeding them a meal. If you can teach them to be self-aware and to regulate themselves and recognize when they're getting too close to a boundary and they need to adjust it, then that's really helping them take care of themselves and advocate for themselves for the rest of their lives, rather than depending on teachers to spot signs of burnout and rein them in.
Right. Creating those habits early and allowing somebody to have access to the kind of information that they can be their own advocate, But I think also, it's about creating a culture in which people feel the ability to speak up and to advocate for themselves. I think that historically, especially for boys and men, the culture of just toughing it out and just pushing through and trying harder and buckling down to get to the next stop can be really toxic.
Sure.
And so the willingness to be vulnerable, the willingness to say, I'm not okay, and to ask for help, those are things that are both individual and systemic. I think that we need to be advocating for young people in terms of creating a culture in which it's okay to speak up. And I think that oftentimes as older people or as parents or professionals or educators, the first instinct is to want to fix, right? It's to want to offer a solution, which is helpful. But oftentimes, I can certainly relate as a young person, when people shoved things down my throat or told me, hey, you should be doing this, my first response, especially as a teenager, would be very defensive.
Sure.
And that's not a way to relate to somebody who's going through a phase in life in which they're trying to define their individuality and they feel like nobody understands, right?
Yeah.
So I think that there's also it's helpful to create a culture in which you're just sort of offering solutions, but also just saying, look, I don't have all the answers. The answers come from within, and essentially, a person who is in that place is going to be best served by feeling heard, feeling understood, and feeling that it's okay to voice what's going on inside of them. So oftentimes the best thing you can do for someone is to show them that you're willing to listen, just to ask questions and to reflect back what you're hearing them say in a way that shows that you are listening and that you do understand. That's literally the first thing they teach you in grad school to become a therapist is reflective listening, right? And it's probably like 90% of what we do as therapists is just asking a question, an open-ended question that allows someone to speak about their inner experience, and then literally repeating back to them what they just said to them. And you'd be amazed how profound that can be for someone, because we go through our days feeling like no one really understands what we're going through, and no one ever takes the time to really listen because everyone else is all consumed with what's going on inside of them. And so when somebody actually just repeats back to you what it is that you just said about, when you really open up and talk about what's going on with you, and somebody just repeats back what you just said, the responses sometimes are like, oh my God, you get it. Like, how did you understand that? I was like, I'm really saying what you just said. I think that's true for anyone at any age, but in particular for young people, teens and people in their young adulthood, at the time in life when you most want to feel connected and understood and feel most disconnected, alienated, and disillusioned. And if somebody actually takes the time to show an interest, and then if they do feel comfortable opening up, that person showing that they actually listened and understood, that can be a profound moment of connection.
Sure. Well, tell us about the services that you offer now as a therapist, life coach. Are they available in person only? Are they available remote? It sounds like you're also doing some speaking to schools.
Yeah, well, I have a few different hats I put on now. I'm an associate marriage and family therapist. And in that capacity, I work at a clinic in Agoura Hills, California called the Missing Piece Center for Anxiety. So that's kind of my day job. And but I have my private clients that I see as well. And I do in person. I do it on Zoom. Actually, the first clients I ever saw in my traineeship were on Zoom during the pandemic. So that was an interesting way to enter into the field. But it's been very fulfilling to be a therapist at this time in the world's history. So yeah, I'm a therapist, and I do both in person and online. As a coach, and I've entered this whole other world, with the book Harder to Breathe and promoting it, where I've become a speaker and a coach. And that is, there's less limits on that. It's less defined than the therapist role, and it's a little bit different. But there's a lot of freedom, because I can go anywhere in the world and speak to anyone, and I can see people from around the world on Zoom, and hopefully help them with some of the things that they're working on in their life that I have some experience with. So they're slightly different hats. I do, yes, both in person and online. And speaking has become another hat that I've put on in this role of advocacy and talking about, up until this point, it's really just been me telling my story and sharing some of the things that I've gained, both individually in my own life and professionally in the education that I've gained as a therapist. But, I'm venturing into a lot of different arenas now, like going into schools, colleges, and universities and speaking, organizations, and talking about some of the things that they deal with systemically. And so, yeah, it's a few different hats that I wear. And on any given day, I might be wearing one or three or four of them.
That's the place for listeners to go to find more about these different services that you offer, or connect with you, get in touch with you.
Yeah, the one-stop shop is my website, ryandusick.com. If you send me a message through there, that's the quickest way to find me. And
that's spelled RyanDusick.
Yes.
Got it. Great. Any other recommended resources that you want to give to us in addition to your book, your therapist and coaching roles and services that you offer? Are there any other books or websites or blogs or any other resources that you just want to increase the awareness of?
Sure. Well, there's a book that kind of changed my life at the moment that I read it, that I always recommend if people want a good read, in terms of just a very practical approach to changing your relationship with yourself and your mindset going through life. Mindfulness is a buzzword, that has become omnipresent, and half the time that people use it, I don't think they know exactly what it means. I know that I had a misunderstanding of what mindfulness was, because I'm a classic overthinker, and mindfulness just sounded like, well, that's the opposite of what I need. I don't need to be mindful. I need to be less mindful, But there's a book called Full Catastrophe Living by John Kabat-Zinn, who is kind of the godfather of mindfulness.
Sure.
And the way that we relate to it now. It's a big, thick book, but really you only need to read the first part of it, which is about 150, 60 pages, to get a grasp of what mindfulness really is and its benefits. There's a whole other section later in the book, a small chapter about stress in particular, that is very helpful in terms of understanding what stress can do to the body, what it can do to the mind and body, and just even like inflammation in the body and your immune system and all these things. That chapter was really insightful in terms of what happened with me and how helpful it is, the mind-body connection, and how important it is to de-stress. But the first part of the book is really just all about the mindset and the attitudes and the practice of mindfulness as a meditation, but also as a way of life. So I always recommend that, because it's kind of a one-stop shop to kind of really change your relationship to your mind, body, and spirit very tangibly in a relatively short period of time.
Great. I'm just going to read a couple quick quotes from your book that I really loved. Well, one is a quote from James Valentine, maybe in the foreword at some point in the book, maybe an endorsement of the book. Harder to Breathe is not only a detailed chronicle of the early days of the band, but an inspiring story of redemption. Ryan's personal journey is inspiring and will remind those in need of help that change is possible. And really love that quote by James, who's a member of the band. And I loved your descriptions of him and how he came to the band. partly because I'm a Midwest girl, and he was like the representative of the Midwest in your band. Everybody else was pretty much from LA. And when you talk about how he sort of chickened out on telling his previous band that he actually quit and was joining Maroon 5, and you thought he had already told them because he said he was going to, and just, here's this nice, sweet Midwest boy who just can't, doesn't want to hurt anyone's feelings. I was just laughing out loud when I read that. Like, that is totally Midwest, Minnesota. He's not from Minnesota. I think he's Nebraska, but still. And then just the story of the closing song that you had at a lot of your concerts for a time. He was just begging you, please don't play that closing song when we're singing in Utah and Nebraska, where my family's going to be, because he knew they would find it so inappropriate. So the band acquiesced and played something probably equally inappropriate in his family's mind, but I love those stories. And then just a quote from you from the book. My intent in writing this book has been to offer an example of how accepting help can actually change and possibly save a life. This stuff is not easy, and there are no shortcuts. The only way through it is through it. However, the rewards on the other side are so worth it. So love that. Highly recommend the book. Ryan, I ask all my guests to close out our conversation with a musical ending, coda, by sharing a song or story about a moment that music enhanced your life. Is there a song or story that you can share with us today in closing?
Yeah. In terms of my musical life, I think we all can relate to the music that we fell in love with in our teen years. In particular, it seems to be around age 14 to 16 or 17. The music that we love at that moment in our life, in that transitional moment in our life, kind of stays with us forever and becomes a part of the fabric of our being. And for me, I was 14 years old when the whole Seattle grunge era of music started, with Nirvana coming out in 1991 with Nevermind. And I really connected with that music and those idols of rock stardom of my teen years. Kurt Cobain, Eddie Vedder, Chris Cornell, and others. But in particular, Chris Cornell of Soundgarden and the band Soundgarden were my favorite band and continue to be probably my favorite hard rock band of all time. A lot of people wouldn't know that, listen to Maroon 5, that we had those roots in grunge, but our band actually was heavily influenced by that music at the time that we started. Adam and Jesse were kind of the Pearl Jam guys. Mickey was the Nirvana guy, and I was the Soundgarden guy. And I think that the reason why I connected with that music and Chris Cornell in particular so much was that it was this really almost paradoxical intersection between power and vulnerability. Mm. And I mean, Chris Cornell, you look at him, and he was this beautiful guy, very good looking, and a rock star in any right, and had this incredibly powerful, soaring vocal range. The music was heavy and driving, and just an onslaught of guitars and drums in a way that, for a teen boy that was just playing the drums a couple of years, was absolutely awesome in a very masculine way, very, very strong and powerful. But then you have this very wounded soul singing very dark and heavy lyrics about the pain that he was going through. And that was something you didn't really see. I mean, there's the storied history of the blues, but this was like the most over-the-top heavy music with the most dark and vulnerable and sensitive lyrics. And there was just something about that dichotomy between those two elements of the music that really spoke to me, and something that I really related to, because I felt like as an athlete growing up, I related to that hyper-masculine power and strength and pushing through. But then I also felt like I had a really strong connection to my feminine side, and that I was a very sensitive boy. I was shy and introverted, and I had these anxieties and insecurities, and in some ways I couldn't relate to the sort of hyper masculine model of what it was to be a boy or a man. So that music really spoke to me, and I felt that connection. And also, I think that music took on extra meaning for me, because when I got sober in 2016, I was about to celebrate my first year, a year of sobriety in 2017 when Chris Cornell died. Mm-hmm. And of course, we had lost Kurt Cobain back in '94, and that was a wake-up call in terms of the heaviness of that music and the people that were making it, and the realities of what these people were going through. But it was a reminder at a very important moment in my life, and he had already meant so much to me in the music that he'd created and the person that he was. But even in his death, it was a wake-up call for me, that this is what this can lead to, the substance abuse or mental health issues. For him, his music clearly was his coping mechanism. And for the longest time, I'm sure it was helpful to people like me who connected. And there's that word again, connection, right?
Right.
With what he did so powerfully. But even he, this seemingly superhuman man who had all this power as an artist, succumbed to the issues that he dealt with. And so it was just a reminder for me, being at that pivotal moment, another transition in my life as I was as a teenager, first listening to that music, that as I enter recovery, just how fragile this thing is, and how we do need to be mindful of how we take care of ourselves and speak up when we're going through something. It kind of came full circle for me in that moment. And so to this day, Chris Cornell and Soundgarden is still, they're very meaningful to me, and I think will be for the rest of my life.
Thank you so much to Ryan for sharing his story with us today and sharing even more of his experience in his book, Harder to Breathe. I highly recommend it. There are links in the show notes to the book, as well as links to many other resources from our conversation and from Ryan. You'll also find a transcript of this episode in the show notes and links to related episodes you may enjoy, including Harnessing the Power of Music to Stay Sober, how a drummer created a rock star full body workout, and how to use rock music for corporate team building and wellness. All Enhanced Life with Music episodes are evergreen, so be sure to check out the back catalog for more ways that music can make your life better. You'll find today's show notes at mpetersonmusic.com/podcast. This is episode 173. A link to the page is also in the episode details right in your podcast app. You can always connect with me on email, mindy@mpetersonmusic.com, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Until next time, may your life be enhanced with music.